Hey y'all, welcome back. Today I want to take you on the journey of creating my neon style sign. Some of you may know that I host another YouTube channel that's all about strength and conditioning and what it takes to be a strength coach. And in that, I wanted a more professional backdrop or a more interesting backdrop. So I decided, why not combine my two passions together and create a neon sign? So this one had some really intricate router work. It definitely tested the limits of my creative capabilities, especially with the tools that I currently have. And I learned some kind of cool lessons in the process. So I want to share that experience with you. So let's hop in. I built this sign on a pre-made 24-inch disc from the big building and home improvement store. As you can see, I've spread a piece of transfer paper over the disc and laid a printout of my logo over the top. I measured the width of the logo and marked the center point, then lined up that 12-inch from the edge point. I repeated this in the vertical direction so that the barbell would be in the center of the sign, then taped everything in place. I'm being very careful throughout this whole process to not press down on the transfer paper and leave marks from my fingers that could convolute the clarity of the transfer. I used the capped end of a Sharpie to trace the outline for a few reasons. The first, it feels like a normal writing utensil, because it is one. Second, it leaves nice, solid, clear lines. And third, it doesn't have any sharp edges that could catch on the paper and cut or tear the logo or transfer paper. Removing this setup is always a little nerve-wracking because it's almost impossible to reline up if something was missed when tracing. Luckily, it was a successful transfer. The lines aren't perfect, but that's to be expected when tracing by hand. I'm going to come back with a marker and straight edge to clean up the lines and make them more visible. Now, I initially decided to use a chisel to carve out all the letters. My thought was, from how intricate some of the angles are, that I would be able to make sharper lines by hand than with the router. As I was cutting though, the open grain of the pine was really tough to not chip out, especially as I tried to make the channels deeper. I managed to get about 1/8 of an inch out of each letter using a combination of chisels with a hammer and some finer carving tools, but I really wasn't happy with it. 1/8 of an inch with jagged bottom really isn't enough to guarantee a solid resin after sanding and finishing. I finally got brave and set up the router. I used a 1/4 inch bit on the letters, and you can almost immediately see how much smoother the process went. I also became more confident getting up to the edges as I went, so the later letters are cleaner than the first few. This was lesson 1. If you have a tool that is meant for the job or meant to make the job easier, use it. I'm always nervous that I'm not going to be able to control the router or it's going to go skating across the piece. In reality, this little router with a sharp bit, especially in the 2-handle plunge base, handles really smoothly. I think a lot of the warnings out there about uncontrollable routers are related to the bigger, more table style ones being used where small ones should be, or from running one with a super dull bit. For carving out the barbell, I unplugged the router and switched to a 1/2-inch bit to speed up the process for the larger channels. After routing, I quickly ran the sander over the surface just to knock down those little flaky pieces of wood so they don't end up sticking out of the resin later, then used a chisel to clean up the corners that the router just really couldn't get into. My logo has a relatively boxy font, so this step may not be necessary for a more bubbly, rounded font. Time for resin. I mixed up some general purpose epoxy resin. First the hardener, also known as part B, then part A. You can see my resin is starting to get old by the fact that part B is starting to yellow, so I mixed up a little more than what I thought I would need. This gives it the best chance of curing correctly and ensures I don't have to mix up a tad bit more if I didn't estimate correctly. I'm also using a dark opaque color, so it's a good project for using up older resin. Then we mix for about 2 minutes. You'll see it gets all sorts of cloudy, then turns back to clear before I let it sit and degas for 2 minutes, and then mix again. I use a heat gun through the resting and second stir to bring the bubbles to the surface and make the resin a little bit less viscous. It was pretty cold the day I was pouring, so the bubbles got mixed in easy and weren't really surfacing on their own. During the second mix, I added a heaping spoon of black pigment to make sure I got the opaqueness I was going for. I used a smaller cup to be a little more precise on the pour rather than trying to aim and control the bowl I had mixed the resin in. It's important to slightly over pour or at least get a meniscus atop the letters, as resin both shrinks as it cures and will slightly absorb into the wood. I didn't want to over pour too much though, as I didn't take the time to caulk around the edges to create a barrier and didn't want to risk the resin spilling over the edge of the surface. Once cured, it was time to sand. And yes, the resin got close to the edge while it was curing, and I scooped some off with a tongue depressor when I checked on it, so then it didn't get on the edge or adhere itself to the work table. I started with 80 grit on the random orbital sander, but quickly realized I needed the belt sander. Lesson 1 reappears. Use the best tool you have for the job and stop being afraid of them. I was initially worried the belt sander would eat through the overpour too quickly, but even with the 80 grit belt, it had its work cut out. And to those who always ask, yes, I am wearing a respirator and had a vacuum attached to the sander for dust management. Then it was back to the orbital sander for 80 grit, then 100, 180, 220, and 320. It's not transparent, so 320 is high enough to get the sanding swirls out. I did notice a purple hue that I kept trying to sand out. I initially thought it was some Sharpie that maybe didn't get routed off, but even after probably digging into the wood with the sander a little bit too much, I think it might have been the way part of the black pigment absorbed into the wood. I've seen this happen with ink dyes, which is part of the reason I tend to prefer the powdered pigments, but it seems like with the softer wood, it might also have happened with the pigments. This was lesson 2. Let me know in the comments if this has ever happened to you. On to staining. I started with this transparent aged barrel colored stain and got far too much farmhouse chic vibes from it. I wiped off as much as I could and switched to this weathered gray color, which was much closer to what I had visioned. Kind of funny, but a few years ago I needed that aged barrel color for a project and first ended up with that weathered gray by mistake. I was hesitant to use the weathered gray as in the past when I've put it over resin, it doesn't want to come off and I literally have had to sand it off. I was very diligent this time to coat the resin areas last and immediately wipe it back off. I think letting it rest was part of the problem in the past. It was still a very odd stain to work with. It's one of those 3 times thickness ones that's supposed to only need like 1 coat, but it just acts so much more like paint than stain. And the second coat. Time to finally get into the lighting aspect. I found these really cool fake neon light strips that are LEDs but don't have that awkward light gap. The lights are really close together and the diffuser is very thick, so it just gives that neon tube impression. First, I needed a channel for the light strip to run in. I drew the outline of the barbell about 3/4 of an inch away from the resin. As I started to route, the pencil line was tough to see, so I traced it with that purple Sharpie before proceeding with the task. I unfortunately decided to take 2 passes to get the depth I needed, as it seemed as though my little router was getting bogged down trying to clear out all the material with the 1/4 inch bit in 1 pass. The first pass went well, especially with that very clear line. The second, though, to get to that 1/2 inch thickness was so much more trickier. I kind of had to just judge where the center line was and watch to make sure that the bit wasn't cutting new material in the front or from the back of the channel. Then I needed a way to get the light strip from the back of the board to the front. I drilled a pilot hole, then a 1/4 inch on an angle so that the strip didn't have to take too sharp of a bend to get to the front. Then a series of 1/4 inch holes to allow the height of the strip to fit through. I then flipped the piece over and routed in a relief in the back so that the lights didn't have to bend too much and so that they didn't add too much thickness to the back. I added 1 more coat of the gray stain to ensure a clean look and a coat of water-based polyurethane to protect the piece. I got most of the polyurethane on before my camera stand just decided to take a nap, but you get the idea. Finally, it was time to add the lights. I removed the end cap to cut the strip to the length I needed, and so that it could fit through the channels I drilled for it. I had to use some hot glue and some off-camera acrobatics to attach the light strips to the edges, as the mounting brackets they came with faced them the wrong direction. And of course, I had to test to make sure I didn't break the strips bending it into shape. Here's the back of the sign with all the wire management. You can see where it starts with the end cap back on the lights. It enters to the front of the sign, goes around the barbell, returns to the back, runs down the pressure fit channel to the edge to go all the way around, back up the channel to where the connectors just kind of sit pretty flat, then to the transformer box that has a cutout to sit in that allows the power cable to then hang down unrestricted. I added a quick alligator hanger, and it's time for the big reveal. I'm so excited to have this as my video backdrop. Let me know below if you think this was worth all the work. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Bye!